Welcome to the Frontiers Flight. My name is John Miller. I'm a former naval aviator and privileged to have flown with the Blue Angels. I'm a member of the DFW Tailor's Association. The organization is responsible for bringing the Blue Angel FA-18 to the museum today. This aircraft was made available to the museum because last October, the Blue Angels retired all their legacy Hornets that they have been flying since 1987. The team is now in winter training, transitioning to the newer FA-18E. We are very fortunate today to have, via video and on stage, 5 of the 6 demonstration pilots from the 1987 team. Today, the focus of our discussion will be the experiences they incurred when they transitioned from the A4 Skyhawk to the F-18. I would now like to introduce the members of the 1987 Blue Angels. On the screen, lower left-hand corner, the boss, leader, Gil Rud. Top left-hand corner, the left wingman, Donnie Cochran. In the lower right-hand corner, the lead solo pilot, Dave Anderson. And here on stage, number 4, the slot pilot, Walsh, and the opposing solo pilot, number 6, Wayne Molnar. Our moderator today is Ryan Nothhaft. Ryan's aviation legacy began with the formation of the Blue Angels. His grandfather was Butch Forrest. Butch Forrest was a Pacific World War II fighter ace who was directed to form the first Navy flight demonstration team, 1946. Shortly after the team was formed, it took the name the Blue Angels, and Butch was its first leader. Ryan is the director and producer of Blue Angel Phantom's YouTube channel and podcast. Ryan has interviewed many of the former Blue Angels for his channel and has become a subject matter expert. So today, Ryan, we're pleased to have you here as our moderator. And as the boss says before he begins to maneuver, smoke on.
Got it. John, thanks so much for the wonderful introduction for all of us. And I have to say, before we get started, it's an honor to be here at the Frontiers of Flight Museum and to celebrate this F-18 that's coming to the museum. It's a gorgeous airplane, and just all the compliments in the world to the Dallas-Fort Worth Catholic Association for bringing this all together. Now, when you think about the Blue Angels, they're turning 75 years old this year. And you know, it's amazing because they just transitioned to their 9th airframe, which is the F-18 Super Hornet. But when I walked in today and I saw that F-18 downstairs, you know, that represents 34 years of history for the Blue Angels. That is 45% of the entire history of the Blue Angels was spent flying the F-18 Hornet. And so, Boss Rud, I wanted to open up this discussion with you, sir, because in 1986, you were the boss of the Blue Angels when you guys were flying the A4 Skyhawk. And by all accounts, an amazing air show airplane. It served the team for 13 years and over 1,000 demos. So my question to you is, what was the catalyst for the team to transition away from the A4 Skyhawk? Why did they select the F-18 Hornet? And were there any other airplanes? And I'm specifically asking, was the F-14 Tomcat considered as part of that transition selection process?
Okay, well, the catalyst was pretty straightforward. The airplanes were worn out. They were just done. There was nothing to replace them. In fact, during that year, as I recall, we actually had a combination of AIMD and McDonnell Douglas and Nav Air. They took a half of one airplane and a half of the other, the front half and the back half, and welded them together basically to give us a spare airplane. So I'm not saying that they weren't in great shape to fly. They were. We had a wonderful maintenance department, but they were done. We had to go to some other airplane. Now, I believe it was about a year prior when things were happening with Secretary Lehman up in Washington, D.C. to what are we going to transition to? And yes, the F-14 was mentioned. But the problem with the F-14 was a terribly high cost per flight hour, as you fighter guys probably remember. a very complicated airplane and just probably not the right thing for the Blues to fly. The other more ominous choice for us was a T-45. And I remember mentioning that if we have the T-45, we're going to have at least 10 of them because the other folks around the country or around the world are flying a similar training airplane, and they fly as many as 9 jets. So that didn't make a lot of sense. You know, those of us who were lucky enough, and we're on here today to fly both airplanes. I mean, the A4 was a terrific show airplane. It really was, because it had a 700-degree roll rate, which afforded a lot of opportunities for especially solo maneuvers. And it also had high intakes, which allowed us to do all sorts of maneuvers on the ground, taxiing in formation, taking off and landing in 6-plane formations, things that we weren't able to do with the F-18. Let's see. I think that's probably answers your question. Is there anything else there, Ryan?
That's great. We'll come back to you, boss. But
Okay.
Mr. Cochran, Donnie Cochran, great talking to you. Question for you, you know, today in social media, we've been able to watch the team transition to every day to the F-18 Super Hornet. We're now being able to watch, you know, El Centro every day on YouTube. But back in 1986, we didn't have social media. So could you tell us a little bit about that final air show in the A4 Skyhawk? Did the team do anything special to commemorate the air show? And what did you guys do to celebrate the new F-18 Hornet as it came to the team?
Very good question, and bring back some really good memories. First of all, I think the best way to celebrate any air show is to have that final show a safe and very enjoyable experience. So your focus when you're flying the last air show is always on, hey, let me keep my head in the game and get this over with so I can enjoy what we accomplished for the season. As far as what I remember concerning the commemorating the F-18, I remember after we completed the walk down, we had the F-18 taxi out in the Blue Angel colors. And that was exciting to see what we had to look forward to in terms of flying an air show in the F-18. The other thing I remember about the A4 was obviously, like Boss said, there were some really unique things that we had a chance to do. Uh, what stands out in my mind was we had an opportunity to do a 6-plane takeoff in Point Magoo. I'm not sure whether you remember that or not, Boss, but that was the only one that I had a chance to do. And of course, we routinely did the 6-plane landings. And taxiing in and out was always a challenge because you're right there. But it was a wonderful, as Boss said, it was a wonderful aircraft to fly. And to fly the F-18 was a real treat as well. So that's what stuck out in my mind. Also, we had one other thing. We had to celebrate the 40th anniversary. We had a 40th anniversary logo put on our patch and aircraft.
Great. Moving over to you, Admiral Walsh. So as I understand it, a lot of the team members at the time the transition was decided to happen didn't actually have any experience flying the F-18 Hornet, with the exception of yourself. So can you talk about the process that the team had to undergo to learn the aircraft and be ready for the 1987 air show season?
I came out of the A7 light attack community, and my first set of orders after assignment in Molnar was to VX5, which was an operational test and evaluation squadron, and was able to transition to the F-18 there, where I was part of the follow-on operational test and evaluation effort. So this was evaluating the airplane's performance, range, distance, and suitability aboard ship in preparation for the first deployment. Remember, when the team gets the airplane, the aircraft had only made 2 deployments. So it had made a deployment on the West Coast with VFA 25 and 113 on Constellation, and then on Coral Sea for what became El Dorado Canyon, which was a mission against Libya in 1985, 86 time. Which that's a very unique position for the team to take an airplane that has relatively little experience. But the team went over to Cecil Field and took their NATO's quals there. It's about 10 hours or so in the airplane. And then from there back to Pensacola, and then on our way to winter training. It's a real testament, I think, to the human engineering in the cockpit that allows us to take people who are familiar with the airshow environment, put them in a new airplane, and be able to transition within the same year. Just as a comparison, when the Thunderbirds had their mishap in the early 80s with the T-38, they took a full year to transition to the F-16. Lots of reasons behind that, but our mandate was start the 1987 season as best we could on time, which I think was April of that year.
Great. Admiral Dave Anderson, can you talk to us physically about the key differences between the A4 Skyhawk and the F-18 Hornet? I mean, obviously the F-18 Hornet much larger, has 2 engines, but what are some of those key differences between the aircraft that you want to highlight?
Well, Ryan, thanks. First of all, thanks for the opportunity to come in this afternoon. This is quite an event y'all put together. I think the biggest difference that we had to contend with is basically we were going from an analog airplane, being the A4, to really a digital airplane. And not only a digital, but the early stages of a digital airplane, fly-by-wire. I'm sure the solo guys will talk about this a little bit more later, and I don't want to use jargon that maybe not everyone would understand, but I think most of your audience can appreciate when we talk about we're now the pilot's a voting member, and you're making an input to a flight control computer that in the A4, if I moved the stick left and said, I want to go 60-degree angle of bank to the left, the A4 would move the aileron and would give me 60-degree angle of bank to the left. With F-18, if I made that same input, it would say, okay, the idiot with the stick in his hand, he wants to go 60-degree angle of bank to the left. So we'll give him some aileron, but we're also going to put in some leading edge slats. We may give him some differential rudder. We'll get him what he wants, but we're not going to give it to him the way he wants it. And then you do that on top of 6 airplanes, 6 different flight control computers that are making the decision all on their own. And maybe now you're so close together that what you're doing and your plane's doing is affecting the atmospherics that are making the airplane next to you make the decisions. A lot of these things, we didn't know what was going to happen. Give you a quick, for instance, when we were going through the replacement squadron over in Jacksonville that Pat was talking about, we went offshore in their warning area, and I had an instructor pilot in my back seat, and I said, I just want to try something. We were 5,000 feet. I want to try doing the rendezvous that we do in the A4. I want to try doing that, and I want to try just doing a 4-point roll the way we did the 4-point roll in the A4. So first of all, we get at 5,000 feet, and basically I can close my eyes because most of the solo pilots in the audience here can tell you that you basically just hit your leg. You knew what the moves were and how the cadence was and how fast you would do it. So I closed my eyes at 5,000 feet in the front seat of an F-18 with about 10 hours total time. And I put in those 4 control inputs that now, if I was in the A4, I would have completed the maneuver and coming out on the backside. And when I opened my eyes, the plane was upside down. It was still trying to figure out what I was asking it to do. And the instructor pilot would say, well, I don't think we want to do that anymore. So we realized we were going to have to reevaluate the way we flew the airplane. We were in the early stages of understanding what the flight control computer was telling us. We had panels that would say, okay, it had 4 channels and we could X out certain channels. Well, I remember Leroy and I being out in the desert and he'd call it up and say, hey, Hollywood, 2 of my flight control channels just say they're X'd out. Is that a big deal? Well, is the plane still flying? Well, yeah. Okay, well, we'll keep going and we'll go back and we'll write it up when we get back. We had no clue what that meant. And that basically in the fleet, that would be almost a major emergency if you start Xing out flight controls. So we had a steep learning curve, not only getting checked out in the airplane, but then try to figure out how to use a digital airplane in the environment that we've been flying in.
Great. Transitioning over to you, Wayne. You were the narrator for the 1986 season in the A4 Skyhawks, and you transitioned up to the solos, the F-18s. But you are one of the taller pilots within your tenure on the Blue Angels. So, as I understand it, the A4 Skyhawk not a comfortable aircraft for taller pilots. Was that consistent with your experience in the F-18 offering you and other taller pilots more relief in the cockpit?
Now, the A4 is definitely a snug cockpit. I didn't fly the A4 in the air show, but I've got about 800 hours in the A4 over the years. When you first get in it, it's a bit claustrophobic. you've flown it a bit, you find that you actually liked it because, as they say, you strapped on the airplane, you strapped on the jet, you were part of it. It felt like you were climbing in the seat of a Formula One car or something like that. You were part of it. Those guys, it was a manual cockpit or a canopy, rather, unlike the electric canopy in the Hornet. You had to pull it down with your hand. Most people had to turn sideways as they closed the canopy and then move their shoulders back. You were rubbing right up against the edge of it. You didn't want to, clamp your plate suit into the canopy. So it was very snug. Yeah, I was one of the taller guys, but it actually had enough room. It was more leg room than it was headroom. And Mark Ziegler came to the team the following year when we were in the Hornet. He's about 2 inches taller than I am. So I'm sure he was glad to have room in the Hornet. So, a lot more room there.
Excellent. Buster, back to you. So you just learned how to fly an F-18 Hornet. Now you got to go out and put together a demo. So can you talk to me about the process of what you did to put together a demo with a brand new airplane you just learned how to fly?
You,
There we go. I'm unmuted. So the first thing we did that was really important to the success of this transition was we convinced the Bureau and our boss in Sinatra and Op 05 that we needed to freeze the team. And we froze the diamond, and we all, I remember coming back and saying, boys, I got some really bad news for you. You get another year as a Blue Angel. Anyway, so the diamond stayed the same, and we brought Leroy in because he had already been number 7, and Grizz was already completed 4 years as the lead solo. So it was, although he did help us during the beginning of the transition. So Leroy was the only new guy. So we weren't teaching people how to be a Blue Angel. We could concentrate on how we were going to use this airplane and be able to fly it. The other thing was Sponge. We talked this kid that came from VFA 106 into coming over with an airplane. He was chasing the team. And we talked him into getting in the back seat while Sponge got in the front seat. This is about halfway through the show season in 1986. And so we flew 3 A4s and we put the F-18 in the slot. And when we did that, Sponge used full nose down trim. And as he came over the top of the loop on the backside, he cleared the formation. And I said, "What's the matter, Sponge?" He said, "Boss, I don't have enough stabilator authority to make the bottom." And that's kind of when we realized that we were going to have to put a field system in there. Now, at this point, I'm going to turn that over when Sponge gets his next shot, because he did the work on that with Pax River. And it was really important because there was no way we could fly this airplane successfully without that spring on the stick. Okay, so we came back to Pensacola, and now we start flying mostly in 2-ship. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 together, just flying the airplane out there, and eventually we worked our way up to burner drills. Burners ready now, and we trying to match these burners, and I mean that's not easy to do. And so then it was coming out of burner, going into burner, and we were all over the sky there, just flying up and down the coast of right off of Pensacola there. And eventually we got that under control. And so then we headed for El Centro. And as we got out there, our goal was, and again, Sponge being the ops officer at the time, and we knew we had to be safe. I mean, we could not be out there and try stuff and have somebody get hurt. And so what we did was, let's do the A4 show. Let's see what we can do. If we can do all the A4 maneuvers, that's great. We knew we couldn't do some of them, but we felt like we could do quite a few of them. And so we started with that. Let's see how many of those we can do. And then we started to add things, some by accident. Okay, in the sense that the solos were out practicing a clean loop, dirty loop. And Hollywood comes back and he says, "Boss, it's so easy to do a dirty loop in this thing. I think you can do it with a diamond." And that's how we eventually worked our way into doing a diamond dirty loop, which is, I think I'm correct in saying that we're still the only team in the world that does that today. I will tell you that we had some setbacks. We lost some gear doors on the backside of those maneuvers until we kind of figured out how to get her slowed down. But anyway, the other thing we did when we got out there to El Centro was we had seen a clip of, I think it was MiG-29s. I don't think it was Russians. I think it was Polish or somebody, and they were doing a loop on takeoff. And it was same way, same day. They were all over the sky, you know. But we thought, hey, I think we can do this. So Mark Bircher, you know, hope he's not with us today out here, but Mark was on my wing. We get out there and I said, well, let's try it. So I get up and I take off and full burner, and I get, you know, up, and I don't come out of burner until I'm over the top. Right? And at this point, I come out of burner, and I mean, we are skyrocketing down for the ground and going, whoop!
Are we all frozen here?
Looks like it. That must not have ended well.
Well, I mean, we can.
Attempted to do a diamond dirty roll. Okay. And that was really awful, boys. Remember that? We were all over the sky with that one. So anyway, it was a piece by piece type of process, and a lot of debriefing and go, is that going to work or not? But you had to have some patience with that. But don't forget that fuel system. That was critical.
Great, thanks, Bossard. Donnie, Bossard's highlighted some of the maneuvers like the dirty roll he mentioned, but can you talk to me about some of the other maneuvers that were either added to the demo or removed at the demo because they just weren't compatible with the new F-18 that were compatible with the A4? Would love to hear your perspective on some of the maneuvers that were added and removed.
Well, I think Boss did a great job of covering the maneuvers. The loop on takeoff, obviously, the dirty loop was another maneuver. We used to do in the A4 the dirty row, which we tried in the F-18, and that didn't work for us. We also tried little V landings. That we did that for a little while, and there was some concern about planing leaks, failure, and that sort of thing, so we stopped that. But what I remember most is I want to drift back to what Sponge did. One of the things that Sponge did was he really did a good job in terms of getting us focused. Long before we started flying, we had to sit down and write our maneuvers and specifically what we were doing for each maneuvers and write it down on paper. And that really helped in terms of when we got to the F-18, we could actually have something written down that we can deviate from. So I remember distinctly the work we put into the transition before we got in the airplane, writing procedures and getting them down on paper so that we'll have sort of a guideline. Because before then, there were some procedures written before we got there, but not a lot that we could go on. But I distinctly remember Sponge really staying on the team to make sure we had all of those procedures written out.
Great. So one of the maneuvers that the team did in the A4 Skyhawk was the Delta landing, and that's when all 6 airplanes land at the same time. They no longer do that in the F-18. So Pat, I was hoping you could provide some insight as to why the Delta landing was removed from the F-18 demo.
The early history of the F-18 was problematic for some of the areas of structure and support of the landing. So if you look at the landing gear when the airplane is airborne, and as the pilot actuates the lever to bring the gear up, the wheels are turning. Wheels are turning, and then brakes are applied to stop the centrifugal force. The wheels turn to fit up into the fuselage or plane and move up. And some of the early failure modes of that part of the landing gear system were failure to brake. And as a result, that centrifugal force that's turning in one direction as the wheel planes now conveys all that stress to some of the supporting linkages, which is called a planing link. And so those would fail, and then pilot would become aware of it. And when we would put the gear down with a failed planing link, we couldn't control how the wheel would caster once we were on the lane. And there were a number of mishaps where airplanes took a strong turn left or right. So we had to be very careful about that. We also had to be very careful about the low intakes because of the potential for fog. So we really did a close look at just the cost benefit of the risk associated with it. And unfortunately, we had to give it up. It wasn't going to work for the team.
Follow-up, any chance you think it might come back with the Super Hornets?
Possibly, but again, that's a big airplane and fairly low intake. So one of the things that the team would need is to account for the unlikely but very difficult extremis situations where the team's in trouble on the runway with a high rate of speed. We had a way in the A4 to get away from each other. We had drag chutes, and so we had a cadence and calls to separate the back three, followed by two wingmen, followed by the boss. So if the runway was unpredictably slick, we weren't slowing down fast enough, or someone had a hydraulic or brake problem within that 18-wheeler all on the runway, we could separate ourselves. In the F-18, you don't really have a way of doing that unless you add a drag chute to it.
Gotcha. Dave, transitioning to you, you obviously were a solo during your time during the transition. Would love to hear your perspective on how the demo changed for the solos as a result of switching from the A4 to the F-18.
Well, like Boss Rud said, one of the things we committed to early on was we needed to make this transition safely. That was our first priority, and that we knew that following years, other teams that came in would be able to build on lessons we had learned and hopefully come in with F-18 experience. So that was our mantra as we left for winter training. Now, Ryan, I got to be careful. I want to make sure that none of the comments that I make now sound pejorative toward all of the people who helped us get ready to make the transition as we made it. I hope Pat gets a chance to talk later about the amount of work that was done at NavAir and Pax River. There were some great people and some great organizations that did an awful lot of work to help us succeed. However, when we left for winter training, we didn't have a lot of the flight clearances we needed. So even to do the current A4 show, I could only do one 360-degree roll. I think at the time when we left, we were limited to 10 seconds inverted. And I think, Pat, if I remember correctly, I think we got 20 seconds inverted shortly thereafter. So there were a number of things that we left, and when we started trying to put together just do the A4 solo show in the F-18, we found out a lot of things weren't going to work. Just as a, for instance, opposing inverted. We were going to have to, it used to be we wanted to come in and be set a long way out. We realized we were going to have to get much closer to center point, make a late roll in, and then make sure we were level and stable going through center point opposing that. Opposing horizontal rolls. Like we talked about earlier, the A4 would roll at 720 degrees a second if you got it at 0G, and we had to roll it and had to do all solo maneuvers at 0G, so we weren't displacing our flight path left or right, up or down into the other solo plane or the ground. So everything was done at 0G. Well, horizontal rolls in the F-18 were just a non-event. So we quickly realized that trying to do opposing horizontal rolls in an airplane that just doesn't roll that fast, it wasn't worth doing. It wasn't really much of a maneuver. The tuck over roll, another one. We realized if we were going to do it, we had to get it stabilized very late. We couldn't come in the way we used to. Back-to-back roll, we had to drop it. We couldn't stay inverted long enough. Probably the one that surprised us the most was the Fortis. We get out there and we go, okay, I'm going to roll upside down. I'm going to lower the landing gear just like I did in the A4. Well, the landing gear wouldn't come down or wouldn't go up because I'm upside down. And we find out that the F-18 had to use gravity to assist the landing gear being extended. Unlike the A4, I could roll upside down and put the gear down and it would go and it would extend even though it was at 1 -G. And so we would go back and we were talking to a lot of the guys at Pax River and NavAir, and we'd say, hey, can you test these things for us? Can you do this? And we wound up into this catch-22 where, well, we can't do those things you want us to test and evaluate because we're not demo pilots. We're not airshow pilots. We don't do what you do acrobatically. And no, you can't do them and find out because you're not test pilots. And so a lot of the frustrations we were feeling trying to just keep the solo program alive So here I am as the 31-year-old that thinks I am going to be the solo pilot, that all of those 40 years of solo pilots before me are going to blame me for the solo program failing when we left the A4. So the one that was the most interesting was the dirty roll and takeoff. We didn't realize at the time, but when the flaps are down, the F-18 rolls much slower than it normally rolls. So we said, well, okay, I can't do the dirty roll and takeoff unless I have full authority to make for the roll rate, even as slow as it was. So they said, okay, we'll just do a flaps up takeoff. So, okay, we played around 5,000 feet, 2,000, 1,000, 500, 200, 100 feet, practicing it. And then day came when I was going to do it at the field. So I do a flaps up takeoff at the field just so I'll have the roll rate to complete the roll on takeoff, leaving the landing gear down. Well, the nose tire comes, it just shreds itself, goes down the right intake and devours the right engine. And we find out at that time, well, they were using retread tires, still on the nose gear. A regular new tire would be speed rated, so 185 knots, so it wasn't a problem. But when they're putting retreads on the nose gear to save a couple of bucks, we learned the hard way that, okay, we can't use retread tires on solo airplanes if we're going to do dirty roll flaps up takeoffs. So many lessons we learned when we got out there. And I've got to say, not only the support of the rest of the team, but boss having to turn around and answer the phone every time something new happened in the solo program, and having to talk to Dave Morris and Sinatra. I mean, those guys are my heroes to this day for putting up with a lot of the buffoonery that Leroy and I had to go through just to be able to keep a solo program alive.
Great, thanks for that answer, Dave. Wayne, rendezvous are one of my favorite things to actually watch in an air show, which usually happen behind the crowd. Could you provide some insight into what a rendezvous is with the Blue Angels, and did the profile of the rendezvous actually change with the transition from the A4 to the F-18?
True, rendezvous are often part of the excitement most people at the air show don't see, because most of it does happen behind the crowd. Some people would recommend that you should change the way you do the maneuver so you can see that rendezvous happen out in front of the crowd. But that takes away from the maneuver that's being flown on purpose in front of the crowd. You don't want to watch them two things at once. So yeah, sometimes it happens behind the crowd, but what it is as one maneuver finishes, you're trying to get out of the way so you can get up, set up for the second maneuver or third. And in the meantime, the other formation, the diamond, is coming by, whether it's while the solos are trying to rendezvous behind the crowd, or the solos are trying to rendezvous with the diamond later in the show, so all 6 airplanes fly together. And so those are pretty amazing. It's nothing like you do in the fleet. In the fleet, you would just do a controlled rendezvous and join with the other airplanes. Well, here, you need to be joined up as quick as you can so we can get the next maneuver in without a big delay. So it was not unusual for the solos to finish a maneuver and you come off and in full afterburner, you're trying to go as fast as you can for as long as you can to catch the diamond. And when you can't stand it anymore, you go to idle, the speed breaks out, you're cross control on the airplane, pushing and pulling positive and negative G's, trying to get the airplane to slow down now so that you can join up with the maneuver, with the formation for the next maneuver. So sometimes those were pretty exciting. It's not something you do in the fleet, but you practice it so much day in and day out that you got pretty good at it.
Great. Foster, back to you. So when you transition to a new aircraft, obviously, I'm assuming that there's significant changes that happen with the maintenance team. So with having 2 engines per aircraft versus 1, did the maintenance team, well, how did the composition of the team change? Did it grow, and did you have to turn over more people than you usually would because you needed more F-18 qualified individuals on the maintenance team?
Well, I'm going to answer that question in a second, but to Leroy's rendezvous, I just want to make sure that the other bosses out there understand this, that I used to turn my mirrors in so I didn't have to watch those rendezvous, and those boys came in there with 300 knots of closure. So the maintenance team, those are the real heroes of the Blue Angels. My golly, we're so lucky. I mean, imagine being a commanding officer and never having to do a captain's mast or anything like that, and having the absolute cream of the crop coming in to work on your airplanes. For that year, we did boost up the number of people. And for the first time that I think we'd ever done this, we got maintenance people for the F-18 from the Marine Corps, because they were also flying F-18s. And so that was the biggest change. Jim Anderson stayed as the maintenance officer, which we needed, we needed to have that continuity as we turned over to the new airplane. And we had a lot of help from McDonnell Douglas, from NavAir, from AIMD over at North Island, and all the rest of these people in order to make everything work. But there were a lot of unknowns. Our supply chain was very special that first year. We had people in that supply chain from NavAir, from the SUPO, the Navy Supply Corps, and everything to make sure that we had the parts. We weren't sure what we were going to wear out because we're flying that airplane a lot differently than they're doing in the fleet. And so we made those type of changes to make sure that we were successful, that we did not pick up Blue Angels maintenance people who were not quality Blue Angel material. Okay, that was the most important thing. You get more people, but they better be the right ones.
Great. And Donnie, can you talk about your relationship as a pilot with your crew chief and the maintenance team? How important is that relationship between the pilot, crew chief, and maintenance team?
Well, I think it's number one, I think it's vitally important. One of the neat things about, or perspectives about being a part of the team, was the special relationship between the pilots and the maintenance team. You knew if you had an aircraft issue, you knew it was going to be taken care of. But the relationship between the pilot and the crew chief was even better. And the reason for that is your crew chief was the last person to see you get in the airplane and the first person to see you get back on the ground. And that relationship was one of the keys for setting you up for success. Not only that, they took care of the pre-flight for you, you set the cockpit up for you, and they cheered you on, and they knew whether you had a good flight or not, and they would cheer you on even though may have felt differently about your performance. So I believe that relationship between the pilot and the crew chief and the maintenance team is one of the best that you can possibly have in an organization.
Great. Transitioning a bit, Dave, you actually had an event in the early winter training of 1987 that required you to eject from your aircraft. Can you give some insight into what happened during that event and how quickly were you able to resume winter training as a result of whatever may have happened during that impact?
Well, let me answer the last part of that first, if I can. It was the 12th of February that I actually ejected, and I went flying again on the 14th of February in Sponge's back seat just to get back in the air. And then on the 15th of February, we were back with Leroy and I were back practicing to try to get the solo program going. Now, on the same time, for all of you who were there or are still there on active duty, that didn't mean that we didn't go by the normal procedures. We had a FNAV board, we had JAG investigation, we had an accident investigation, we had people crawling all over the squadron while we were still trying to keep our heads in the game and go about getting winter training done on schedule. And I can't say enough about the level of support we got, again, personally from me, from my team members, from my boss, and then as I alluded to earlier, up the chain of command. And I think it went pretty high because we were told, we understand what you're trying to do, just let the process work out and we're gonna hopefully make everything come out. So I've actually had a chance over the years to sit down and have a scotch or two with Boss Rud and recount those days. And I think I have articulated him how much I appreciated his support through those days. And I learned a lot of lessons in leadership that served me well, I think, in the years to come. Now, back to the particulars. As I alluded to earlier, no, they couldn't, Pax River, NavAir, they could not give us a lot of the answers we needed. And so being a good solo pilot with a very low IQ, I started doing basically my own test program. The particular day when we had the ejection, when I had the ejection, we were in the desert and Leroy had a malfunction of his aircraft and he returned to the field. And so I stayed out to continue doing some practicing. And the way I was doing this, I'd not been doing it long, but I was talking to Mo on the ground and video was running. And so I would explain to him, okay, guys, I'm going to come in. This is what I'm going to do. I'm going to do this with the plane, this many negative G's on the airplane. Well, the particular maneuver that happened, we knew that at the time, there was a series of lights called AMAD lights. And if I got an AMAD light that came on in the cockpit, I knew I basically had about a second and a half that I had to get positive G back on the airplane or I was going to have a flame out. And Pat had actually done extensive work on this. And at the time, we knew being in inverted and using afterburner was a non-starter. And I was trying to find out how true that was, because the hardest thing to do as a solo pilot is learn to get out of a poorly flown maneuver. And as we talked about earlier, the Diamond, these four guys, not only had they been together for a year, but they were good. They were very good. They were basically, with the exception of maybe starting some new maneuvers, these four guys were ready to start. They could have flown an air show 4 weeks after we got to El Centro. And here we are with a solo program, and Leroy and I are trying to figure this thing out. And that student-instructor relationship, not only am I supposed to be able to do what I need to do, but I need to be able to teach my opposing solo what he needs to do, not only for the normal maneuvers, but when something goes wrong that you can't predict. And one of those is when a maneuver goes bad, how do you get out of a bad maneuver? And it's not always rolling upright and pulling. Sometimes if you're inverted, in the A4, we had to just stop where we were and push to get away from the ground. So one of the things I was doing was one of the maneuvers I had a basically high negative G, up to about 2.8 negative G, which is about all we could get in the Hornet, as opposed to the 3.5 with the A4. So I'm doing a high negative G, and I decided to tap burner. I wanted to see what it would do, how long I could sustain it. So I was doing basically an outside half cubit 8. And I basically came out of it, got positive G on the airplane. And after I got positive G, and I think, okay, I guess everything's fine, then the AMAD lights came on. And I'm talking to the guys on the ground. I'd say, I don't know what's going on, but I've got positive G on the airplane. Well, I had basically driven the airplane to full fuel starvation. And unfortunately, the Hornet was so different because the engines were so far back and the fuel tanks are so far forward. It takes a while to get for the pumps to get the fuel back to the engines. So I didn't have a prayer of getting a relight. And so here I am, I'm contemplating trying to do a dead stick into to El Centro, and I'm going, wait a minute, this is an electric airplane. That's not going to work out so well. So I stayed with it probably longer than I should have, and finally left it when I had it where it was not going to hit to either Brawley or El Centro at the time. The lesson learned is we got an inverted fuel pump. It took us a full year. We really knew we pretty much identified the solution, which was taking an F-18, or excuse me, a F-15 fuel pump and bolting it on inside the access panel for the fuel tank. And our tech rep had pretty much come up with that solution, but we couldn't get it approved at the time. So the fact that I lost the airplane really was the impetus, I think, to get the inverted fuel system that they have now. Because the reality is, the rest of that show season, there were 5 other times in the show season that we were in a maneuver that I had a flame out sequence started, that I had that second and a half, I had to get positive G back on the airplane. And I remember coming in, I think it was Moffett, field boss. And I remember coming in to debrief, going, hey boss, I can't keep doing this. I don't want to lose another airplane. And you're talk me back down off the ledge, and we'd go on and we'd go, okay, we keep going until we had another one. But I think we're 5 of them we went through that year. But being able to document all that really was able to get the support for the chain of command to then get the modifications that the team still has. And served them well for the next 30 years. Long answer to your question, Ryan. I hope that helped.
It was great, and I think it's a great segue to our next question, because Pat, in 1987, you guys transitioned to the F-18 Hornet. It's not like you're handed standard operating procedures and a safety manual for the F-18 on how to fly with the Blue Angels. So what effort did your team specifically undertake to ensure that those procedures were documented going forward?
So what Dave described in his previous answer was really the pressure on the program. Pressure on the program was to take the airplane as is. So remember where we are in just the history of the F-18. Only 2 fleet deployments. These are pre-production airplanes, so they are not airplanes that are representative of what fleet capability it is. The fuel system that Dave described is a doghouse, and the doghouse works under positive G When you go to negative G, it closes all the flapper valves, and whatever inverted fuel envelope you have is trapped inside that doghouse. So that's the problem in a dynamic environment of then how reliable is the warning system. And in the case of the Hornet, for what we had, you're cavitating fuel lines when you get warned. So the first indication of a problem is loss of pressure. The ability to regain that pressure is first luck and positive G. And so, the Solos lived in that environment for the entire season until we were able to get modifications made. And I think modifications made largely because people saw the value of what we were doing and the importance of being able to perform safely in front of a crowd. And all the work that the Solos did to bring that forward and to put it in clear factual language to inform now leadership at Navy Air at Patuxent River of the challenges that we had with the flank clearances that we had. So being able to memorialize all this and to be able to pass it down, that was part of the burden, the obligation of staying the additional year. We owed that to the team that followed us to be able to have all of this documented. And so the way we approached it was we started with the boilerplate Blue Angel air show, which we inherited from the A4. And that was largely the cadence and the language that the boss would use in order to communicate with the rest of the team. So just as JJ pointed out, it says, before he starts a maneuver, he says smoke on. That's exactly the way boss was when he was on the team. He would turn his smoke on and then he would start a maneuver. We would have to catch up with him. But sorry. The way we memorialized this, as Donnie had described, is we went to kind of a first-person account. So we merged the cadence and the boilerplate sort of language, the communication plan throughout the formation. And then we would now integrate the left wingman. This is how the left wingman looks at the situation, prepares for the maneuver, responds to the boss's inputs. And these are the corrections, and these are the sort of problem areas that I've had. And so when the season was over, each person had their own SOP, where they had the plan that was common for when the formation was together as a delta, or when the formation was together as a diamond. But also embedded in that was now a first-person accounting of this is what I see, this is what I do, these are the mistakes I made, and here's how we make it better for the next team. I think the overarching sort of theme of this team and the humility that goes with it is the recognition that we're really lucky to have gotten the jobs that we've had. We're really glad to be here. And at the same time, we want to pick people who can do a better job than us. And that's a common sort of frame of mind that people are in. And I think it keeps it healthy, it keeps it sustainable. And I think as the question was leading us, it keeps it safe as we pass from one team to the next.
Great. And part of that safety that the team's always had is doing very thorough briefs and debriefs. Wayne, I'd like to have you provide more insight into exactly what those sessions are like, what are they for, and how intense can they get at times?
Actually, you spend more time briefing and more time debriefing than you do in the air. Prior to every flight, you sit down and you cover everything that will pertain to the flight. You talk about the weather, the runways. If you have a problem, where are you going to do an arrested landing if you need to? And then the boss will go through his briefing where he discusses every maneuver we're going to do throughout that day that we expect to do. Then once he's gone through that with all 6 pilots, the diamond pilots break off and have a separate brief. The solo pilots break off and have their separate brief. Then when you're ready, you go out and fly the air show. When you come back, that's where you really make your money. They film the entire air show. They've got the from the moment you start walking down until you fly all the maneuvers and you walk and march back. So it's all critiqued all the time. The lesson I learned the most about the debrief was, and I think it helped build trust throughout the rest of the team, was if you admitted your mistakes and knew what you had done wrong, then it helped the rest of the team realize that you understood, what you did or didn't do well, and that you knew what you needed to correct. If I made a mistake and didn't fess up to the team, well, somebody needs to tell me, because we can't have me making a mistake that I'm not even aware of. So it'd be up to Hollywood or somebody to point out that you haven't done what needed to be done, and here's what you should have seen, in advance. You should know what you've done wrong. You may not know how to correct it, and we can learn how to do that. But I think the big thing was fessing up that you made a mistake. It may not be a big mistake. You may, I was just slightly deep on the roll or whatever. Nothing big or not a safety problem, but just knowing that every little mistake that you made during the day, during the air show, is something you need to account for, so that tomorrow, hopefully you don't make that mistake. And if you come forward and admit to people that you've made the mistake, that puts everybody at ease, and it just builds a lot more trust with the team.
Great. So as we wind down this discussion, we're going to do a quick round robin. We're going to start with you, Boss Rud. It's going to be the same question for everyone. Boss Rud, what did you find as the most challenging maneuver during your tenure on the Blue Angels?
Well, the boys are probably going to argue with me here, but I thought that the line of rest loop was the hardest maneuver we did. In the A4, we had to have a very high speed coming in to set up from a perch in order to make sure we could do it successfully. It was a wider arc than normal maneuvers, and any deviation on my part, as far as wing movement and that, would just make it impossible for them to be successful. So Mark Bircher told me, and this was in A4s in the first year, we're going through, he said, Boss, you're dropping your left wing over the top every time, but don't fix it. Because if you make a correction, we're going to get a rate going. And this is a maneuver where it's one of the only maneuvers where, there is no backup to me. This is what got the Thunderbirds in the T-38. Sponge is normally behind me, to check to make sure that I'm pulling at the right altitude. There's none of that involved. And again, you just, in the A4, the gyro would tumble as you're, I don't know, maybe 90 degrees nose up, and then you'd lean back and look for the horizon as you'd come over the top. And sometimes, especially over water, there wasn't much of a horizon out there. So it was one of those maneuvers that I felt a lot of pressure on. Now, fast forward many years to my daughter going through the training command, and she is flying T-34s. And she calls me up one day and she said, Dad, I don't know what's wrong. He said, but every time I do a loop, I drop my left wing over the top. I said, kid, you got to live with it. It's in the genes. Yeah, so that was the hardest maneuver I felt like that I had to do. Oh, and the other was the sixth plane landing. Oh my goodness. So for some reason, a lot of us Blue Angels are LSOs, or we're former LSOs. So now I'm from the lead up here, and I got at least 4 or 5 LSOs behind me, all critiquing the landing. And for some ridiculous reason, the limitations were 90-degree crosswind of 6 knots or more, and you couldn't do it. I don't know where the 6 knots came from. You guys remember that, though. That's what it was. And man, I had to hit on centerline, right on centerline. All the old A4 bosses can tell you this. And then, you're the last to land. Like Sponge talked about very clearly, back row down, 2 and 3 down, then you're down. And if you get a blown tire or anything happens, then you got to go, boss needs to shoot. Then the back row shoots, 2 and 3 shoots, then you can pull your chute. And remember, in the A4, our slats are bolted up. So we're probably about 10 knots faster than a fleet A4 in landing. So that was another tough one.
Great. Donnie, why don't you share your most challenging maneuver from your perspective?
Okay, that's pretty easy for me. It was the left echelon roll, the lure. Now, that's a maneuver that the crowd really didn't have appreciation for how much work went into that maneuver. But from a wingman standpoint, when you're 3 aircraft away from the boss, trying to line those helmets up as you start a roll is a handful. And especially on the backside of it, when you're trying to get a stabilized bottom and not pumping number 4 out of the formation, that was a real challenge for me flying that maneuver. And we did it in the F-18, and I think we did it what, 1 year, and the second year we decided to move on from the lure. But it was a really handful of a maneuver to fly. There were other maneuvers that were challenging, but that stood out in my mind. Like Boss said, the six-plane landing, six-plane takeoff was interesting. I'm glad I had a chance to do one of those. I'm not sure whether we did more than one, but I remember one from Point Magoo when the weather was bad. But other than that, that's a good recap for me. The left echelon roll was it.
Great. How about from your perspective?
Well, if it was hard for Donnie, so you find out who your friends are in formation. The left echelon roll is a roll into you, so the echelon is rolling into you. That's hard to do. It was possible to do in the A4 because you could really cross control the airplane in a way where we would use inside rudder to just hang in the formation. In the F-18, that got a little squirrely. If you started to cross control the digital flight controls, they could get confused. So we'd end up with a maneuver that we were never really happy with in terms of looking at the video drive.
Gotcha. Dave?
Well, I think every pilot would appreciate that the absolute hardest maneuver for you to ever do is a sneak pass. I mean, no, sneak pass was the greatest maneuver. I mean, it's 0 degree of difficulty and you had the most fun you could possibly have. But I see a theme building here on the most difficult maneuver. We've never had discussion before, guys, but we made it almost all the way through winter training and we had started doing Delta. But we're finally putting 6 planes together. One of the last maneuvers I think we introduced as the Delta before we left winter training was doing the Delta roll. Well, I had done a year of the Delta roll on the right outpost using positive G to make the turn. And all of a sudden we decide, boss said, okay, we got to get this Delta roll down. So, okay, we join up and I didn't think I was going to ever be able to do a Delta roll from number 5 position. It had to be the hardest thing. And I don't think I got the curl out of that thing the entire year, not once. But that was the maneuver. So that anytime you've got an echelon turning into you where you have to unload and cross control, it doesn't work so well. It especially, like Pat said, in the digital airplane. So I'll keep the trend going. That echelon turning into you, that was hard.
That's where we first learned social distancing.
Wayne, how about yourself?
Well, it's funny Dave brings that up. I hadn't really thought of it in terms of the toughest maneuver, but I swear he's correct. From the time the formation got right there until it went 180 degrees, I had no idea where I was. I just kept sight of the guy ahead of me and tried to be where I was supposed to be. The one I was thinking about was the tuckover roll. It was difficult for the solos because most of the solo pilots coming from crowd right, you roll upside down together. Now you're flying upside down at 75 or 100 feet, and the lead solo, who is not leading this maneuver, has to call the hit it for the roll off and go out for the maneuver. So you're flying upside down, you're flying formation, and the lead solo has to look and find the center point, so he makes the rollout call at the proper time. So it was the hardest, but I think most solo pilots would also say it was the funnest maneuver when you got it right. Particularly the one place that stands out to me was in Seattle. They've changed the flight line since we flew there, but the place where you would roll the tuckover roll in, you came between a set of trees and there was a little island, so there were these 2 monster pine trees. By the time you flew the Seattle show, you were getting pretty good, so it was always fun to call the roll in right as you went through those pine trees and 2 airplanes upside down.
So that gets us to our hour. I just want to, first of all, thank the Dallas Fort Worth Tailhook Association for putting this together and this beautiful museum, the Frontiers of Flight Museum. Just a fabulous museum. And thank you so much. For me personally, the 1987 team was the first team I ever saw at an air show at Moffett Field, and I got to watch that with my grandfather, Bush Forrest. So this personally couldn't be any more special for me. So thank you so much, and thanks everyone for taking time to listen today.